Al-Khwarizmi authored the first work on algebra drawing on both Greek and Indian resources. The centrality of the Quran to the new Islamic religion also led to growth of Arabic linguistics. 110. From Baghdad knowledge and texts were to flow back to South Asia and down through Africa, with a large collection of books and an educational center around the Sankhor Mosque in Timbuktu, the seat of the Songhai Empire. During this period the deposed Abbasid Caliphate moved its seat of power and learning to Córdoba, now in Spain, where they founded a major library which reintroduced many of the classic texts back into Europe along with texts of Arab learning. Early universities in Europe. The reintroduction of classic texts into Europe through the library and intercultural intellectual culture in Córdoba, including works of Plato, Aristotle, Euclid, Ptolemy and Galen, along with Arabic texts such as Avicenna and Al-Khwarizmi, created a need for interpretation, lectures, and scholarship to make those works more accessible to scholars in monasteries and urban centers. During the 12th century, universities emerged from these clusters of scholars in Italy at Bologna, in Spain at Salamanca, in France at Paris and in England at Oxford. 111. By 1500 there were at least 60 universities throughout Europe, 112, enrolling at least 750,000 students. 113. Each of the four faculties, liberal arts, theology, law, and medicine, was devoted to the transmission of classic texts rather than the production of fresh knowledge beyond lectures and commentaries. This form of scholastic education continued well into the 17th century and beyond in some locations and disciplines. 114, 115, 116, 117, 118. Printing and the growth of knowledge in Europe. Johannes Gutenberg's European introduction of the movable type printing press around 1450 created new opportunities for the production and widespread distribution of books, fostering much new writing, with particular consequences for the development of knowledge, as documented by Elizabeth Eisenstein. 119. The production and distribution of knowledge was no longer tied to monasteries or universities with their libraries and collections of scribal copies. In the ensuing centuries, a politically and increasingly religiously divided Europe, no single authority was able to censor or control the production of books. While universities remained attached to disseminating traditional texts, publishing houses became the new centers of knowledge production, and publishing houses in different jurisdictions led to a diversity of ideas becoming available as books moved across borders and scholars came to see themselves as citizens of the Republic of Letters. The comparison of multiple editions of traditional texts led to improved textual scholarship. 120. The ability to share and compare results from many regions and enlist more people into the production of science soon led to the development of early modern science. 119. Books of medicine began to incorporate observations from contemporary surgery and dissections, including printed plates providing graphic displays, to improve the knowledge of anatomy. 121. With many copies of traditional books and new books appearing, debates arose over the value of each in what became known as the Battle of the Books. 122. Maps and discoveries of exploration and colonization also were recorded in books and governmental records. 123. Often with the purpose of economic exploitation, as in the archives of the Indies in Seville, but also to satisfy curiosity about the world. 124. Printing also made possible the invention and development of scientific journals, with the Journal des Sçavans appearing in France and the Philosophical Transactions of the Royal Society in England both in 1665. Over the years these journals proliferated and became the basis of disciplines and disciplinary literatures. 125. genres reporting experiments and other scientific observations and theories developed over the ensuing centuries to produce modern practices of disciplinary publication with the extensive intertexts which represent the collective pursuits of disciplinary knowledge. The availability of scientific and disciplinary books and journals also facilitated the development of modern practices of scientific referencing and citation. These developments from the impact of printing on the growth of knowledge contributed to the scientific revolution, science in the Renaissance and science in the Age of Enlightenment. Modern research, university and writing. In the 18th century, a few Scottish and English dissident universities began offering summary practical and contemporary studies, offered instruction in rhetoric and writing to enable their non-elite students to influence contemporary events. 126, 127. Only in the 19th century, however, did universities in some countries begin creating place for the writing of new knowledge, turning them in themes in years from primarily disseminating classic knowledge through the reading of classic texts to becoming institutions devoted to both reading and writing. The creation of research seminars and the associated seminar papers in history and philology in German universities were a significant starting point for the reform of the university. 128. Professorships in philology, history, economy, theology, psychology, sociology, mathematics and the sciences were to emerge over the century, and the German model of disciplinary research university was to influence the organization of universities in England and the United States, with another model developing in France. Both, however, prized the production of new knowledge by faculty and to be learned by students. In elite British universities, writing instruction was supported by the tutorial system with weekly writing by students for their tutors, while in the United States regular courses in writing were often required starting in the late 19th century, with writing across the curriculum becoming an increasing focus, particularly towards the end of the 20th century. Military knowledge and classified documents. Military knowledge of strategies and devices date back to the ancient worlds of Egypt, India, China, Greece, and Rome, with both historical accounts and manuals for conducting war. After printing was introduced in the West, manuals for construction of fortifications and battle strategies were widely produced, as nations frequently were in conflict. With the growth of chemistry and other sciences, however, knowledge of new weaponry was frequently restricted to secret documents. Other documents also of limited distribution developed around policies, production, and distribution of the new weaponry. 129. By World War I, both the Allied and Axis powers applied new technologies based on scientific advances to military uses, particularly chemical weapons, with over 5,000 scientists engaged in developing and producing weaponry, while attempting to limit access to the information in secret documents. 130, 131. The drive towards secret knowledge, including novel research and not just applications of prior knowledge, became especially intense with the race to develop nuclear weapons in World War II, as in the U.S. Manhattan Project. Aviation, rocketry, radar, encryption, and computing were also the subject of classified documents. This system of classification of knowledge continued after World War II ended as the Cold War ensued. The tension between the needs for military secrecy, open scientific research, and citizen deliberation over military policy led in the United States led to the Atomic Energy Act of 1946, which created civilian control, but through a continuing regime of classified knowledge. 132, 133, literature and writing. The history of literature followed after the development of writing in Sumer, which was initially used for accounting purposes. The very first writings from ancient Sumer by any reasonable definition do not constitute literature. The same is true of some of the early Egyptian hieroglyphics and the thousands of ancient Chinese government records. Scholars have disagreed concerning when written record-keeping became more like literature, but the oldest surviving literary texts date from a full millennium after the invention of writing. The earliest literary author known by name is Enheduanna, who is credited as the author of a number of works of Sumerian literature, including Exaltation of Inanna, in the Sumerian language during the 24th century BCE. 134, 135. The next earliest named author is Tehutb, who is credited with authoring the Maxims of Tehutb, an instructional book for young men in Egyptian composed in the 23rd century BCE. 136. The Epic of Gilgamesh is an early notable poem, but it can also be seen as a political glorification of the historical king Gilgamesh of Sumer, whose natural and supernatural accomplishments are recounted. Psychological implications of writing. Walter Ong, Jack Goody, and Eric Havelock were among the earliest to systematically argue for the psychological and intellectual consequences of literacy. Ong argued that the introduction of writing changed the form of human consciousness from sensing the immediacy of the spoken word to the critical distancy and systematization of words, which could be graphically displayed and ordered. 137, 138, such as in the works of Peter Ramus. 139. Havelock attributed the emergence of Greek philosophic thought to the use of written word, which allowed the comparison of beliefs and belief systems and the critical examination of concepts. 106, 108, Jack Goody argued that written language fostered such practices as categorization, making lists, following formulas, developing recipes and prescriptions, and ultimately making and recording experiments. These practices changed the intellectual and psychological orientation of those who engaged with them. 140, 141, while recognizing the possibilities of all these psychological and intellectual changes that accompanied her literate practices. Sylvia Scribner and Michael Cole argued that these changes did not come universally or automatically with literacy, but rather were dependent on the social uses made of literacy in the local contexts. 142. They carried out field observation and experiments. Among the Vai people of West Africa, for whom the psychological impacts of literacy vary due to the three different contexts in which folks learn to read and write the Vai language, English, and Arabic, practical skills, secular education, and religious education, respectively. European language literacies were associated with European style schooling, and fostered among other things syllogistic reasoning and logical problem solving. Arabic literacy was associated with the religious training of madrasas and fostered, among other things, heightened rote memory. Literacy in the written forms of Vai associated with daily practices of making requests and explaining tasks, increased anticipation of audience knowledge and needs, along with rebus solving, as the written language used rebus-like icons. Following a different line of inquiry, James Pennebaker and colleagues have carried out many experiments establishing that writing about traumas can relieve anxiety, improve mental well-being, and improve physical health measures and outcomes. 143, 144, see also. History of numbers. History of art. List of writing systems. History of journalism. History of newspaper publishing. History of knowledge. History of science. Notes. More recent